And in the wake of this front page story in the Wall Street Journal, I'm joined now by Mary F. Schiavo. She used to be the top aviation watchdog in the United States and has since done pioneering work as an aviation safety lawyer in the space of whistleblowers and aviation safety in general. Ms. Schiavo, welcome. Thanks for being with me here on NDTV. I'd like to begin by asking you for your views on this new Wall Street Journal article, which has added another layer of detail in its reportage of the AI-171 crash, where they've basically reported that the pilots did it. That one pilot switched those fuel control switches off, and another was panicked and confused, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah, well, first of all, as to panic and confusion, in the situation in which the pilots, were in, what they faced would cause certainly an alarm. They were able to respond and try to restart the engines, so they weren't so panicked that they could not act. But in any case where you have a highly computerized aircraft with a million lines of code doing something that both the pilot flying and pilot not flying both said they did not do the fuel cutoff. One pilot asked the other, did you cut off? The other said, no, I did not. So taking facts, and remember, that's all the preliminary report is, the facts that are known at the date they put that out at 30 days. They have a mystery, but a very terrifying and serious condition in the cockpit. At that point in takeoff, right when you reach 180 knots, your nose is supposed to be pointed up above the horizon and you're supposed to have full thrust to climb. All of a sudden you don't have full thrust and your plane levels off instead of being pointed up to climb. It's a very tough situation. The Wall Street Journal article is, I'm sorry to say, but it is just taking this preliminary report, which was very straightforward, does not blame the pilots, and runs afoul with it. There is no evidence in the preliminary report or anywhere that this was an intentional act by either pilot. There's certainly no evidence at this point of suicide or what would be mass murder. No way.
Is that a possibility, though, Ms. Schiavo? Is deliberate pilot action a possibility, or is that not at all a possibility in your view?
There's nothing that points to that at this point, especially since we've had a prior incident on a 787 Dreamliner that's very similar. Aldepon Airways back in 2019, the National Transportation Safety Board investigated it and found that the aircraft itself put the engines into fuel control cutoff because the plane mistakenly thought it was already on the ground. And so we already know that. So no, I don't think there's anything at this point to point to that. I have worked many, many crashes over the years. I've worked probably hundreds of cases. But I have worked several cases where pilot suicide, pilot murder was alleged or blamed, and in all cases where it turned out to be the case, there's evidence. There's evidence on the cockpit voice recording. There's other evidence outside. Here we see none of that, and we have to give the investigators, the AAIB, time to do their investigation. This investigation, this is hugely important. The first crash of a 787. Yeah. This investigation is not done in 30 days. This investigation has barely started. It will take a year, probably more, to do this investigation.
And what you're saying, Ms. Schiavo, then, is that from what we know and from all the crashes that you've seen in the past, this preliminary report does not point to deliberate pilot action, but does very much point to the possibility of technical or mechanical failure?
Well, yes, and preliminary reports do not. That's the whole point of a preliminary report. There are standards, international standards, as to what you're supposed to do in safety. It's called a safety investigation because you investigate so it doesn't ever happen again. And in the preliminary report, you're only supposed to put out at 30 days what you know, what the facts are. Now, I think they would have been aided in their cause of putting out only the facts had they put out the transcript, a transcribed version of the cockpit voice record rather than summarizing. I think that's where the trouble lies here. But this report makes no recommendations. It makes no finding of fact, makes no finding of cause. And they're not supposed to. The preliminary report is not supposed to do that because they have the whole investigation ahead of them. This investigation will be thousands of pages long. The docket alone, that's when they publish all the evidence that they have gathered, it will be, it could be 1,000,000 pages. This investigation is so big and so important because, an aircraft is a flying computer. There are 1,000,000 lines of code or more on this aircraft. And because we know the aircraft can shut off the fuel by itself without the pilots touching it, because it's happened before, the investigators will go through all of that. They will not fail to look at the aircraft, the lines of code, the flight control operation by the plane and by the pilots. They will have, when this is over, they will look at all this, but there is no blame, there is no cause, there are no recommendations in the preliminary report, and there are not supposed to be those things in the preliminary report. That's not the purpose of a preliminary report.
Flight 171, Ms. Schiavo, was in the air, as you of course know, for 32 seconds. Do you think that the preliminary report could and should have had a full transcript of what was said in the cockpit rather than just, paraphrase one scrap of conversation?
Well, so what usually happens is you do the transcript, and it's actually a written transcript. In the U.S., you cannot release the actual audio recordings.
Yeah.
But usually what happens is the investigators then post that transcript on the official investigation website that's in what's called the docket, so that people can see it for themselves. I do think they didn't do themselves any favors by paraphrasing and putting that in, but there's certainly nothing illegal or wrong with them doing that. And the transcript is also subject to interpretation. When you do an investigation, you have a team of experts listening to that cockpit voice recorder over and over again, listening for inflections, listening for other sounds, the sound of a click, the sound of a movement. And so it could be that the transcript is not ready yet. And that is certainly understandable. This is a very important transcript.
You've had all of this rich experience in aviation safety and litigation, Ms. Schiavo. What does the coverage of this crash tell you on the aspect of the angle that this was pilot suicide or deliberate action? What does that tell you?
Well, saying what it may have been, if you include obviously the aircraft, other issues, many things. For example, people have coverage has said, well, that they looked at the fuel. Obviously there were other possible causes and they aren't done looking at. They did note that they took samples of the fuel and it was not fouled, meaning it wasn't bad fuel.
Yeah.
There are other things. For example, they'll be looking at whether the engines had vapor lock. There are situations where the engines themselves, the fuel gets blocked. There are hundreds of things it could have been, but because of this paraphrasing, I think people have jumped to the conclusion at this point with the evidence that we see, or rather that we don't see. How do you prove a negative that something did not happen? There's just no reason to jump to the conclusion that people are. And it can hurt the investigation. It's a well-known problem in investigation. It's called investigation bias, where you jump to the conclusion first, and then you try to make the facts match your conclusion. And many of investigation has gone afoul by trying to prove what you want the investigation to say rather than where the facts lead you. But I have no doubt that the AIB will do this over the coming months and perhaps years, because this is a worldwide important investigation. It has ramifications literally for flight around the globe.
My final question to you, Ms. Schiavo, is on the issue of vested interests. A large part of your work, has revealed this aspect of aviation accident investigations, vested interests, the big players, those who stand to gain from certain angles and certain agendas or certain narratives. Do you see that here as well?
Well, yes, in every investigation, remember the parties to the investigation, the official investigation, are those who have an interest in the outcome. Strangely, however, they never include the families of the passengers.
Yeah.
But, for example, the airline, the pilots union, Boeing, the engine manufacturers, General Electric of Cincinnati, Ohio, governments, by the way, the makers and contractors for the electronics in the plane, they are all, quote, parties to the investigation because they have an interest in the outcome. And obviously they can also have a huge financial interest in the outcome. But, trying to skew the investigation can also lead you into great trouble. For example, if you speak out of turn and make public statements and you're part of the investigation, you can be excluded from the investigation. The rules allow the AIB to do that.
Yeah.
You mouth off in the press, part of the investigation, you're out. And also, if you mislead, for example, right now in the United States of America, Boeing is facing criminal, not civil, criminal charges in the United States District Court for the District of Texas in Dallas-Fort Worth because they misled and made false statements, allegedly. The plea hasn't gone through yet, to the United States Federal Aviation Administration. So you better not mislead the government, because in the United States, it can lead you to a criminal charge. And I think that was a sobering mood that had to happen because of the 737 MAX 8 crashes. And that weighs heavily on everyone's mind, hopefully, at Boeing.
Mary Schiavo, thanks very much for speaking to NDTV. Like you said, the preliminary report was 15 pages long. The final report is potentially going to be thousands of pages long. And we will wait for that and hope to have another more detailed conversation with you. But thank you very much for your words and your time here on NDTV.
Thank you.